Hello, everyone. Tonight we're going to do something unusual. A story that begins not with a scream in the woods or a body in the attic, but with a ship. A very large, very modern, very expensive ship that should have been full of life smoke in the kitchen, footsteps on the deck, tired voices on the radio. Instead, it arrived at port like a ghost, its steel body humming with power, but its crew gone, vanished. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you really like what I'm doing here. And hey, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. If you're somewhere near the ocean, even better, you might find this story a little too close for comfort. Now turn off the lights, lie back on your comfy cushions, and let's get moving tonight. It was 3:14 in the morning local time when the port control tower first spotted the silhouette. Singapore's southern harbor isn't exactly a quiet place. Every hour, tankers and freighters slide past the glittering skyline, horns, low and deep like church organs. But this vessel was strange from the start. Radar had picked it up just after midnight, 30 nautical miles offshore, moving in a steady line toward the port entrance. The name on its side, Elysian Dawn, was clearly visible as it passed the breakwater lights. It was a container ship 260 meters long, flying the Liberian flag, registered and accounted for. The paperwork said it was carrying electronics from Taiwan to Rotterdam with a stopover. Nothing unusual. Except for one glaring detail, there was no radio call. Maritime law is strict. Every ship approaching a harbor has to announce itself, request clearance, give crew manifests, confirm health and safety. Yet this vast ship drifted forward with its engines still humming, as if an invisible hand were guiding it. By 3:30, harbor police were already scrambling boats. Dock workers on the night shift leaned against railings watching as the enormous hull glided silently into berth. They described it later like a subway train pulling into a station with nobody inside. The docking was perfect, almost suspiciously perfect. No collisions, no stuttering engines. Someone or something had managed the approach with mechanical precision. The gangway lowered automatically as if waiting for people who never came. When the boarding party climbed up the steel steps, flashlights cutting through the dark, the unease thickened. No captain at the bridge, no deckhands securing ropes, no quartermaster scribbling notes in the log, just a faint hum of machines and the salt smell of the open sea. One officer described it bluntly. It was like stepping into a hotel lobby where every suitcase is still in place, but the guests just walked out in the middle of the night. They started with the bridge naturally. All the dials and gauges were steady. Fuel was fine, autopilot engaged, GPS locked. A half-empty mug of coffee sat beside the console, still faintly warm. The ship's course log showed nothing strange, just a straight path from the South China Sea into port. "Where is everyone?" one officer muttered. His voice echoed back at him in the wide, empty room. As they moved deeper into the ship, the strangeness grew. Crew cabins were left in states of abrupt departure, bed sheets still crumpled, wallets on nightstands, a pair of glasses folded neatly beside a paperback book. In the galley, a late dinner sat abandoned. Plates of rice bowls of soup, chopsticks scattered like someone had just gotten up mid-bite. The soup hadn't even gone cold. It wasn't the first time a ship had drifted in empty. Maritime history has a few famous examples. The Mary Celeste in 1872 found in the Atlantic with everything intact but no crew. To this day, people still debate whether it was piracy, mutiny, or something more spectral. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether the Elysian Dawn was destined to become the modern Mary Celeste. But here's what makes it unsettling: in the old cases, at least something was wrong. Torn sails, water in the hull, broken equipment, signs of struggle. This ship, nothing. In fact, it looked as though the crew had simply evaporated mid-sentence, leaving the steel giant to complete its journey by itself. By dawn, the port was swarming with officials. Police cordoned off the gangway, forensic teams in white suits moving methodically. Reporters weren't allowed near, but rumors spread faster than fire in dry grass. Someone said the ship had been drifting for weeks. Another claimed the cargo contained something radioactive. By breakfast time, local radio was already calling it the ghost freighter, but the people who were actually there gave the most chilling detail: the silence. Big ships are never silent. They creak, they groan, pipes hiss, metal sings. And of course, people talk, shout, laugh, curse. On the Elysian dawn, only the engines whispered steady and calm like a lullaby for the dead. One worker swore he heard footsteps above him as he entered the mess hall. When he rushed up, flashlight darting, the deck was empty. He never admitted it again in official reports, but his colleagues noticed he stopped working night shifts after that. At 8:45 that morning, harbor authorities confirmed the obvious: the Elysian Dawn had docked with no living soul on board. A missing persons case was filed not for one or two unlucky sailors, but for the entire crew. 22 men and women gone without a trace. Families were notified. International calls went out. By lunchtime, Interpol had a file open. And yet, nobody knew what to call it. A crime, an accident, a maritime glitch. Some whispered of piracy, though no signs of violence showed. Some pointed to accidents at sea, but why would everyone abandon ship with no distress call? And then there were those, always a minority, but loud, who said it was something far stranger, that the Elysian Dawn had crossed into a place where human presence cannot last. Strange detail: the ship's clock was 3 minutes slow, even though it had been synchronized daily by satellite. A small error, yes, but one that would bother investigators for years. The harbor police chief summed it up with frustration in a press interview that same evening. "We have a functioning ship. We have meals on tables. We have beds still warm. And we have no crew. Tell me, how do I write that in a report?" The reporter nervously laughed. But the chief didn't. The Elysian Dawn sat there steel gray against the sunrise, a hollow shell pretending to be alive. On paper, it was a cargo vessel worth millions waiting for unloading. In reality, it was a stage missing its actors. And the audience, us, was left to wonder what had happened before the curtain fell. Because if 22 people could vanish into thin air while surrounded by steel walls and GPS satellites, then the sea was still the same as it had always been: vast, dark, and full of things we cannot explain. And this was only the beginning. The dock workers who had gathered to watch the ship that morning would tell the story for years. They weren't supposed to be anywhere near the berth once police cordoned it off, but curiosity has a way of bending rules. Men leaned on forklifts, women with clipboards pretended to check manifests, all of them stealing glances at the monstrous hulk of steel that had glided in without a single human voice on board. Singapore's harbor is no stranger to accidents. A crane collapse in the 1980s, fires in container yards, even the occasional stowaway story. But never this, never a ship docking itself like some obedient mechanical whale and then refusing to give up its people. By 10 a.m., reporters clustered at the gate, cameras flashing. Police tried to wave them off, but the words were already out: ghost ship. You can't put those back in the bottle. Inside the perimeter, the search widened. 22 crew members had names, ages, nationalities. Mostly Filipino and Indonesian seafarers, a Chinese cook, an Indian engineer, and of course the Greek captain. The police chief wanted answers before the press turned the story into a circus. Officers spread across the decks in pairs, each with radios crackling. They reported back every few minutes. Mess hall, untouched meals, no sign of struggle. Crew cabins, clothing, folded wallets in place, ID cards on desks. Medical bay, unopened, fully stocked. Cargo hold, all containers sealed. One unsettling detail repeated in every log: there were no life rafts missing. Each orange capsule hung neatly in its cradle, untouched. If the crew had abandoned ship, they hadn't used the equipment provided. And then there was the bridge. It looked staged, like a movie set left after filming. Charts laid out on the table, a logbook open to the last entry, autopilot humming as if waiting for applause. The last log line read simply, "Course steady, seas calm." Investigators and detectives are still debating whether what happened next was human error or something stranger, because in the control room an engineer noticed something off. The ship's engine, a massive Wärtsilä diesel beast, was still running at idle. Fuel levels showed it had been trimmed precisely for arrival, no extra burning, no sudden drop. Someone had slowed it manually at exactly the right moment to glide into berth. Someone had to be here, the engineer muttered. This doesn't happen on its own, but no fingerprints turned up on the throttle, no sweat smudges on the helm, not even a stray hair. Every surface was scrubbed clean, almost sterile. It gave the impression that the ship had guided itself. By early afternoon, tension thickened. Officers were starting to argue. One said, maybe a rogue wave knocked people overboard. Another snapped back, all 22. In calm seas. Someone else suggested food poisoning, but the meals were untouched and no trace of toxins appeared in the galley samples. The forensic team swabbed every railing, every doorknob. Nothing. A few partial prints too smudged to match. Even in the crew cabins, toothbrushes and combs lay spotless as if bleached. And yet the ship smelled lived in. A faint scent of shampoo in the showers, fresh coffee grounds in the bin, shoes by the bunks scuffed with use. It was as if the people had simply evaporated, leaving behind the faintest warmth of their existence. One officer, a young woman named Tan, walked the deck alone and later admitted she felt watched. She turned quickly, expecting to see a crewman emerging from a hatch. Nothing. Just the hum of the diesel engine below and the water slapping gently at the hull. When she leaned on the railing, she noticed something unusual, a seagull perched on the mast, staring directly at her. In a port that bustled daily with ships and workers, gulls were normal. But this one stayed perfectly still, its black eyes unblinking as though it was waiting for her to make the next move. It unsettled her enough to retreat inside. She never put that detail in her report. By evening, the chief inspector had to make a decision: treat it as a missing persons case or a full-scale crime scene. He chose both. Uniformed officers remained to guard the vessel, and international calls went out to maritime agencies. Families of the missing were contacted, voices breaking across static phone lines. The Filipino Seafarers Union demanded answers. Greek newspapers splashed headlines about a captain swallowed by the sea. The public devoured it. Ghost ships had always been legends: the Flying Dutchman, the Mary Celeste, the Kaz II. Now here was one in the modern era with computers and satellites and radar. A ship that shouldn't be able to hide anything had just delivered the biggest mystery of the decade right into the heart of Singapore. The port, usually alive with mechanical roars, grew quiet around the berth. Dock workers refused overtime shifts near the Elysian dawn. Tugboat captains joked nervously about catching the ghost. And every night as the sun set and the ship's dark silhouette loomed against the skyline, someone swore they saw movement on the upper deck. A shadow pacing a figure leaning on the railing, vanishing when spotlights swept across. The rational explanation: a trick of light. Human eyes playing games when confronted with the unknown. But the whispers spread, and with them came dread. The ship wasn't just empty, it was watching. The third day after the Elysian dawn docked, investigators finally pried into the one thing everyone had been waiting for: the captain's log. If any answers could be found, they would be scrawled there in the looping pen strokes of Captain Nikolaos Andros, a man with 30 years at sea and a reputation for discipline. The logbook sat on the bridge, open as though waiting for him to return. The last entry was dated 4 nights earlier, somewhere in the South China Sea. It read simply: course steady, seas calm, all hands present, and then nothing. No sign-off, no remark about Storm's illness or even fatigue. Just silence after a lifetime of meticulous records. That was strange enough. But as investigators flipped back through the pages, they noticed something else: a shift in handwriting. For weeks, the captain's neat block letters chronicled mundane details: fuel use, weather reports, crew morale. Then 2 entries stood out, written in a jagged, hurried-style letters, slanted, as if the hand was trembling. One read, unusual lights off port side, crew unsettled. Will investigate at dawn. The other, voices on the wind, not possible. Am I losing reason? And then, as though embarrassed by his own lapse, Andros returned to neat, unemotional notes about engine checks and routine watch. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether those erratic lines were genuine or inserted later. Forensics could not confirm ink age with precision. The sea humidity had blurred distinctions. Some experts believe Andros wrote them during a moment of stress. Others whisper the entries were planted to feed the legend. But the unease didn't stop there. In the back of the logbook was a torn page. Only a single phrase remained scrawled across the margin. They are not us. Those 4 words became a refrain repeated in every newspaper and late-night forum thread. Who were they? What did Andros mean? Theories bloomed like algae. Pirates, perhaps the crew encountered disguised raiders at sea. Mutiny, maybe the sailors turned against Andros, though why leave the ship intact? Supernatural, the fringe idea that the crew had met their doubles or worse. The official line remained cautious, no evidence of foul play. But privately, officers admitted the handwriting looked almost manic, like someone scribbling under duress. Meanwhile, searchers combed the captain's cabin. His uniform hung neatly in the closet, brass buttons polished. A framed photo of his wife and daughter rested on the desk. Nothing suggested he intended to disappear voluntarily. But tucked under his mattress, investigators found an envelope. Inside, an old clipping from a maritime journal. It described a 1955 incident in the same waters where a Dutch freighter reported strange, glowing spheres hovering above the sea before vanishing from radar. No wreckage was ever recovered. Why would a seasoned captain keep such a story close to his bed? A sailor's superstition, or a warning he had taken seriously? At a press briefing, the police chief tried to downplay the findings. "We are reviewing routine ship documents," he said, his face stony. But the press had already learned about the line. "They are not us." Cameras flashed, questions shouted. One reporter asked, "Does this mean there were imposters on board?" The chief didn't answer. He simply walked off stage. By that night, rumors boiled. Families of the missing crew members demanded clarity. The Filipino consulate pressed for search operations in nearby waters. A Greek journalist claimed Captain Andros had complained privately about phantom voices weeks earlier, though this was never confirmed. Dock workers muttered to each other about shadows. One swore he saw a man in uniform on the bridge window after midnight, only for the cabin to be empty when searched. And then came a recording. A technician reviewing the ship's radio logs stumbled across a short clip stored on emergency backup. The timestamp matched the night of the final entry. A voice crackled through static. "Dawn to harbor. Do you read? Repeat, dawn to harbor." Then silence. Then faintly, another voice, softer, distorted, almost a whisper, repeating the captain's words in the same tone, like an echo that didn't belong to him. The hairs on every listener's arm stood up. Maritime history is full of strange cases, but investigators could not dismiss this. A clear call, and then mimicry. Was it interference, or had the crew heard themselves doubled? Experts debated endlessly. Atmospheric bounce, one suggested. Sometimes signals reflect, creating ghost voices. Others countered, then why only that line? Why the delay? The unanswered questions mounted, and the logbook's final words hung like a curse. They are not us. Whatever happened aboard the Elysian Dawn, it wasn't simple mutiny or storm. It was something that gnawed at identity itself. And in the port, as the ship sat in its berth, the sense deepened. This vessel hadn't just arrived. It had brought something with it. If the captain's log had rattled investigators, what they discovered next broke whatever fragile explanations remained. The galley, the ship's dining hall, looked less like a workplace abandoned and more like a photograph frozen mid-moment. Rows of plates sat neatly on tables, bowls filled with rice, fish curry, and steamed vegetables. A pot of soup rested on the stove, its surface congealed but unmistakably once hot. Chopsticks lay scattered as though dropped mid-bite. Someone had poured tea. The pot still held liquid, though cold now. It was the detail of timing that chilled the team. Food preservation experts consulted later estimated the meals had been served no more than 12 hours before the ship entered harbor. That meant if the crew truly disappeared days earlier, someone or something had maintained the illusion of routine right up until the last possible moment. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether the galley scene was evidence of a sudden evacuation or something staged. Because here's the haunting part, not a single chair was overturned. Not a single plate spilled. It wasn't panic. It wasn't flight. It was as if 22 people simply stood up at once and walked calmly away, never to return. Forensic teams swabbed utensils and glasses, searching for DNA. They found saliva traces on some fingerprints on others, but all matched the missing crew. No outsiders, no intruders. Every sign pointed to a normal dinner, followed by absence. And yet something was off. One officer noticed the soup pot was still faintly warm, even after the ship had sat empty for hours. "Impossible," he whispered. Either someone reheated it after the crew vanished, or he didn't finish. The report filed later simply noted temperature anomaly. Down in the storage area, more peculiarities. A crate of fresh fruit had been sliced open, oranges and bananas half prepared for dessert. A tin of condensed milk dripped onto the counter, sticky trails hardened in place. On a cutting board, a knife remained stuck halfway through a mango blade, rusting from the juice. These were not the signs of a crew preparing to abandon ship. These were the signs of lives continuing, meals, interrupted laughter, and fatigue suspended in midair. It reminded one officer of the ancient Roman city of Pompeii, where bread loaves were found still in ovens, lives arrested mid-routine by catastrophe. Only here, no catastrophe was visible, just silence. Local authorities tried to push a rational explanation. Perhaps carbon monoxide poisoning, one suggested, and the crew staggered overboard. But carbon monoxide detectors were intact and showed no signs of malfunction. And besides, why would poisoning cause neat departures, no chaos? Another proposed food contamination, but the meals tested clean. No toxins, no parasites. The strangest part came from the dining logs. Like most modern vessels, the Elysian Dawn kept records of meal portions and crew schedules. According to the sheets, every crew member had checked in for dinner that night, all 22, and not one had checked out. The line beneath the last entry was left blank, pen still dangling from the clipboard. Meanwhile, dock workers who had snuck peeks whispered stories. One said the bowls seemed to shift slightly each time he looked, as though invisible hands had nudged them. Another claimed the smell of curry grew stronger after sundown, as if someone was reheating the galley at night. When asked later, none of them would repeat these claims officially, but they refused to step back aboard the ship even when offered overtime pay. Historical context only deepened the dread. Maritime historians pointed out that the Mary Celeste, the most famous ghost ship of 1872, had also been found with food still on the table. Bread, fresh water barrels intact, only the people gone. The similarity was too close for comfort, and yet skeptics pushed back. It's just coincidence, they said. Ships are workplaces. People eat, then leave. That's all. But that argument ignored the timing. It ignored the warmth of the soup, the half-cut fruit, the logs showing nobody checked out. It ignored the captain's final scribble, "They are not us." By the fourth night in harbor, security cameras had been placed around the galley. Officers wanted to see if rats or birds were disturbing the meals. The footage later revealed something else. At 2:12 a.m., the bowls on one table trembled slightly, as though the table itself had been nudged. Seconds later, chopsticks clattered to the floor. No one was present. The camera angle was clear. The air conditioning was off. The room was still. Investigators replayed the footage a dozen times. Some blamed vibrations from passing cargo ships. Others insisted it was simply poor mounting of the camera. But those who watched closely swore they heard something faint on the audio track, a low murmur like voices overlapping in languages no one could identify. The meals remained untouched for days, preserved in photographs, sealed for evidence. They became iconic images in newspapers around the world. Half-eaten dinners waiting for sailors who would never come back. And slowly, a chilling picture formed. If the galley was the heart of the ship, then the Elysian Dawn had a heart that still beat even as its body lay empty. And somewhere between the soup bowls and the silence, a question lingered. What if the crew had never left at all? The cabins were the most personal part of the ship, the only spaces where each sailor could pretend the steel walls were home. Investigators approached them, last half expecting to find answers, diaries, letters, maybe even a clue that someone had seen danger coming. Instead, What they found only deepened the mystery. Each cabin told a story of interruption. In the first room, they entered a pair of reading glasses rested on a paperback copy of Moby Dick. The bookmark sat exactly halfway through. A mug of instant coffee had cooled to sludge on the desk, ringed with the outline of a hurried sip. The bed was unmade sheets, still warm in places when first discovered. Across the hall, another cabin held a half-played game of chess. The Black King leaned precariously on the edge of the board as though nudged mid-move. A bunk bed had one mattress neatly made and the other tangled with sheets, as if someone had just rolled out. Everywhere small details whispered of presence. A toothbrush damp with recent use, a shirt draped across a chair, sleeves twisted as if peeled off in a hurry, an electric razor humming faintly left running until its battery died. And in nearly every cabin, wallets, passports, and watches remained. Nothing stolen, nothing packed. If these sailors had left, they had left without the things people cling to most tightly. Forensic swabs again told the same story, fingerprints, hair traces of DNA all matching the crew. No outsiders, no evidence of a boarding party, but there was one unsettling pattern. In several cabins, investigators found indentations on the mattresses. Fresh ones, as though someone had been lying there after the ship had already docked. One officer pressed his palm against a pillow and swore he felt warmth. He didn't put that in the official report. Among the personal belongings, one item caused particular unease, a notebook belonging to a junior engineer named Mateo Cruz. Its last page contained only 3 words in shaky handwriting: "It's behind us." What it was, no one could determine. But like the captain's log, this fragment became fuel for endless speculation. Some historians compared it to other maritime disappearances. The SS Orang Medan, a Dutch freighter allegedly found adrift in the late 1940s, carried reports of crew members discovered dead with expressions of terror, as though they had seen something unspeakable. Officially, the story remains unverified, but it hovered over the investigation like a ghostly precedent. There was also a sound. Officers conducting cabin searches reported hearing faint noises through the walls, footsteps in the hallways, whispers in languages that didn't match the crew's nationalities. One man claimed to hear his own name spoken softly from the shower stall of an empty room. When security teams checked, they found nothing but condensation beading on mirrors, though the showers hadn't been used in days. The strangest discovery came from cabin 14, belonging to the cook. On the wall above his bed, etched faintly into the metal paint, were symbols, circles intersecting with lines, shapes resembling tidal charts but warped. No one could decipher them. Some said they were doodles. Others swore they were navigational markings not used in modern shipping. One expert from the Maritime Museum called them eerily close to carvings found in ancient Cham seafaring relics dated more than 1,000 years old. Was it coincidence, or had the cook in his last hours left behind something far older than himself? Investigators photographed everything, cataloged every sock and shoe, but the overall impression remained the same: the crew had vanished mid-life. Not during chaos, not during violence, during routine, beds with the shapes of their bodies, showers damp, razors humming, notes half-written. It felt less like absence and more like displacement, as if they had been plucked out of their lives and carried somewhere unseen. And each time investigators stepped out of a cabin, leaving the lights off behind them, they swore they could hear movement within a moment later. A creak of a bed, a sigh, the whisper of sheets adjusting to a body that wasn't there anymore. Back on the dock, officers debated. Was this a case of mass psychosis, where a crew might abandon ship under some unseen psychological trigger? The theory sounded scientific enough, but it didn't explain why the cabin still seemed lived in. The chief inspector summed it up with a grim shake of his head. These rooms are still breathing, but their owners are gone, and with that suspicion shifted. If the cabins told a story of presence without people, then maybe the ship itself wasn't a stage after all. Maybe it was the actor. Reconstructing the last hours of the crew was like piecing together a puzzle where half the pieces were waterlogged and the other half had been burned. But investigators tried anyway, combing through navigation data, engine room readings, and the ship's short, fragmented radio transmissions. The first solid timeline marker came from a simple weather report. At 1847, the vessel's radio officer sent out a standard update: calm seas, visibility low due to rolling fog banks. His voice was steady, routine. At 2013, a navigation log recorded a slight deviation from the shipping lane, just 3 degrees off course, not unusual if they were avoiding driftwood or a fishing vessel. But when mapped out, that change set them on a slow arc away from known trade routes toward deeper, less charted waters. By 2230, things got stranger. The engine room data showed unexplained surges, voltage spikes that made no sense. Lights, flickering generators, pulling more power than the ship was actually using. One engineer logged it in the system as a phantom load. That was the last official entry. From there, investigators relied on scraps. At 2312, a distress signal was picked up by a coastal station. Static heavy, but one word came through clearly: turn. The signal cut off after 12 seconds. At 2319, the navigation system recorded a speed reduction, though no commands had been entered. The ship simply slowed, drifting as if resisting its own propulsion. And then at 2345, radar logs showed something impossible: a second blip following the ship at a fixed distance of half a nautical mile. When the ship slowed, the blip slowed. When it drifted sideways, the blip mirrored. No vessel was ever sighted. Testimony from maritime radio operators who reviewed the recordings added a chilling layer. In the static of the distress signal, some claimed they heard faint, overlapping voices, like a crowd speaking in whispers. Analysts disagreed, dismissing it as interference. Still, the phrase stuck a crowd in the static. Historians pointed out that this wasn't the first time sailors reported phantom ships. In the 18th century, accounts of the Flying Dutchman terrified mariners across the globe, a ghost ship seen gliding just behind their own vanishing when hailed. Napoleon himself allegedly recorded sighting it off the coast of Africa. To skeptics, it's folklore. To sailors, it's a pattern. Could the crew have seen something trailing them in the fog? Something only their eyes, not radar, revealed. By 0003, the ship's AIS system, the automatic identification beacon, went offline. No power failure, no manual shutdown. The system simply stopped transmitting, as if the ship had ceased to exist electronically. From then on, nothing. No further radio, no log entries, no signals. Just silence. The working theory from investigators was that the crew abandoned ship in lifeboats, but this collapsed quickly. All lifeboats were still strapped in place when the vessel drifted into port. Flares were untouched. Personal effects remained in the cabins. More haunting, when divers searched the surrounding waters for wreckage, they found no signs of life rafts, no oars, no floating debris. The sea was empty, as though the crew had never left the steel walls at all. One researcher suggested something radical: that the crew might not have left physically, but dimensionally. In her published paper, she wrote, "If radar showed a second blip mimicking the ship, perhaps the vessel was sailing parallel to itself, in some way two versions of the same reality overlapping. The crew may have stepped from one into the other." It sounded more like science fiction than science, but investigators were desperate for explanations. The families of the missing sailors were left with only fragments. Wives, brothers, children clung to the final radio message: turn. Turn from what? Turn toward what? No one could agree. The last concrete evidence was a half-finished entry in the first mate's logbook, time-stamped 23:29, lights on the water. Not stars, not. The pen stroke trailed off mid-word. And so the final hours became a paradox. The ship's systems suggested hesitation, slowing, drifting, shadowing. The crew's belongings suggested intention: half-finished notes, meals, abandoned lives interrupted. But the ocean kept its secret. No screams, no wreckage, no answers. Just a vessel gliding silently into port with no crew aboard, as if delivered by unseen hands. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether those last hours represent a textbook case of mutiny and cover-up, or the kind of maritime event that belongs in the same category as ghost ships, sea myths, and vanishing aircraft. The only consensus: whatever happened, it happened all at once. The investigation might have stalled if not for the families. They weren't content with half-truths and hushed reports. They wanted answers, and sometimes grief has a way of forcing truths out into the light that people might otherwise keep buried. When the relatives of the missing crew gathered for the first official briefing, investigators expected tears and silence. Instead, they got confessions, fragments of strange conversations, and patterns that no one had put together before. It started with the sister of the radio officer. She recalled a phone call a week before the ship sailed. Her brother had sounded distracted, almost agitated. He told her they've added something new to the cargo, no paperwork. Captain says not to ask. Then, almost as an afterthought, he whispered, "If I don't come back, look in the hold." That detail, the hold, shook investigators since it tied directly to the unmarked container. Another family member, the son of the ship's cook, mentioned something even stranger. His father had sent him a letter mailed from the port just before departure. Inside was a crude sketch of symbols, spirals, and intersecting circles, the same ones later found scratched into the cabin wall. Beneath it, only one line: "Do not dream of the sea." The story snowballed. A daughter of one sailor admitted her father had nightmares for weeks before leaving. He'd wake up shouting about the sound of water in the walls. A brother recalled being told to avoid traveling by boat for the next year. A wife confessed her husband had asked her to burn his childhood journals if anything happened to him. Piece by piece, the families revealed that the crew had been living under a shadow long before the voyage began. The most unsettling testimony came from the captain's own sister. She hesitated before speaking, eyes flicking toward the officials in the room as if unsure she should continue. Then she explained that their family had been tied to the sea for generations. Her great-grandfather had captained a ship that vanished briefly in the 1920s, reappearing weeks later with no explanation. According to family lore, he'd returned mute, refusing to speak for the rest of his life. The captain had grown up with that story, and in recent years he'd begun obsessing over it, reading maritime folklore, collecting old maps, tracing shipping lanes that seemed to repeat in spirals. He thought he was part of it, his sister said softly, like our bloodline was tied to whatever this is. Investigators debated whether these were just grieving people reaching for patterns. But the consistency of details, symbols warning secrecy, was difficult to dismiss. And then came the discovery that made the theory of coincidence harder to swallow. Several of the crew were connected not just by work but by blood, brothers, cousins, in-laws. It wasn't a random roster. Nearly half the missing men belonged to extended family lines with histories in seafaring. The case had begun as a missing persons report. Now it was starting to look like a family mystery spanning generations. One historian brought in to review the testimonies connected the dots to something older. He explained that maritime records from the region contained references to blood crews, groups of sailors who were deliberately chosen from kinship lines, believed to appease the sea through sacrifice or devotion. The practice dated back centuries, though academics debate whether it was myth or history. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether this crew was chosen accidentally or if someone deliberately assembled them for a purpose, he remarked. That suggestion chilled the room. If the shipping company had intentionally staffed the vessel with families tied to maritime disappearances, then this was no accident. But perhaps the most personal revelation came from the youngest sister of the junior engineer, Mateo Cruz, the one who had scribbled "It's behind us" in his notebook. She revealed that Mateo had left a voice message on her phone the night before departure. In it, he said only, "If we see it, we have to go with it. There's no choice." Her hands shook as she replayed the message for investigators. The word it echoed through the investigation yet again. By the end of the family testimonies, a new theory emerged: the crew hadn't been random sailors caught in a freak event. They might have been connected to something older, something their families carried unknowingly or deliberately. Were they victims of the ship's cargo or part of its purpose? On the ride home from the briefing, one investigator muttered to a colleague, "We're not looking for missing sailors anymore. We're chasing a bloodline." The colleague didn't answer. He was staring out the window at the harbor where the tide moved in slow spirals as though sketching symbols in water. The case should have been closed. At least that's what the official paperwork said. The ship had been cataloged, the cargo seized, the families interviewed, but not everyone could let it go. Chief Inspector Hahn, the same man who once described the cabins as still breathing, began showing signs of obsession. He'd been on dozens of maritime cases in his career, everything from smuggling busts to gruesome accidents, but this one lodged in him like a splinter he couldn't dig out. He stopped sleeping. His wife later testified that he would wake at 2 or 3 in the morning, pad silently to his study, and play the security footage of the cargo hold again and again. The tape of the crew standing before the coffin-shaped object, their lips moving in unison, the moment the footage cut to black. Hahn swore that every time he watched it, the lips formed new words. Once he thought they said open, another time return, and once disturbingly, his own name. His colleagues noticed the change. He began carrying the engineer's notebook with him everywhere, flipping to the last page that read, "It's behind us." He claimed if you held the page under lamplight at the right angle, more words appeared, words he couldn't quite decipher, but he swore were. Investigators tried to intervene, but obsession can be persuasive. Hahn argued that the case wasn't just unsolved, it was ongoing. That the family's stories of bloodlines, the unmarked cargo, and the missing crew all pointed toward a pattern still in motion. Ships don't just come back without people, he said. They come back because they've delivered something. One night, Hahn made an unauthorized visit to the impound warehouse where the unmarked container had been stored before being whisked away by government officials. Security cameras captured him pacing the floor, shining a flashlight across the scorched steel. In the audio, he's heard whispering, "If it's behind us, where did it go?" Minutes later, the tape shows him freeze, head tilted, as if he heard someone whispering back. The warehouse was empty. When security guards confronted him, he claimed he'd seen footprints in the dust-wet barefoot prints leading away from the container and vanishing against the far wall. No prints were ever photographed. Officially, no report was filed. From there, his spiral deepened. He started mapping the crew's genealogy, tracing family trees across continents. He discovered, or believed he discovered, that several ancestors of the missing sailors had been listed as lost at sea in different eras. He pinned photographs and old ship manifests to his office wall string, connecting them in spirals that mimicked the symbols carved in the cook's cabin. His theory was no longer professional, it was personal. He claimed the crew hadn't disappeared randomly, they had been taken back into some recurring cycle, a contract between bloodlines and the ocean itself. Colleagues whispered that he was losing his mind. But none could ignore that the shipping company stonewalled every request for deeper records, refusing to reveal how the unmarked container had ever been loaded. Then came the voices. Hahn confessed to his wife that he could hear the missing men at night, not screaming, just murmuring. He said they spoke in overlapping tones like the static crowd in the distress signal. Sometimes he heard them in the shower drain, sometimes in the hum of the refrigerator, once in the low echo of his car's engine. He wrote in his private journal, "They aren't gone. They're just on the other side of the hull. Thin steel, thinner water." Historical parallels offered him no comfort. He read about the 1872 disappearance of the Mary Celeste, another ship found adrift with no crew, meals still warm. Officially, explanations range from mutiny to alcohol vapors. Unofficially, sailors whisper that the crew stepped into something unseen. Han added the Mary Celeste crew to his wall of spirals. His colleagues finally intervened when he attempted to requisition a patrol boat to retrace the ship's route. They denied him, so he went anyway, renting a fishing vessel under his own name. According to his notes, he planned to follow the course from the last navigation deviation into the fog banks where radar had once picked up the phantom blip. He carried with him the engineer's notebook, a compass, and a recorder. Only fragments of those recordings survive. Wind waves the clink of the boat hull, and then faintly his voice, "I see the lights." Not stars, not the tape cut off mid-sentence. When the patrol team finally found his vessel, it was drifting. Engine idling, the compass needle spinning slowly in circles. Han was gone. To this day, investigators and detectives are still debating whether Han's disappearance was a tragic act of obsession, a man driven too far by grief and mystery, or whether, like the crew before him, he had been pulled into the same cycle. What was certain was this: the mystery was no longer confined to one ship. It had spread to anyone who looked too closely. Ports have long memories. Sailors vanish, ships sink, but stories cling to the docks like salt to wood. That's why when the first sightings of the missing crew began to circulate, investigators didn't dismiss them outright. The sea has a way of spitting things back. It started in a fishing village 200 miles down the coast. An old man swore he saw a familiar face wandering the market at dawn. He said it was the cook from the vanished ship, barefoot clothes, damp hair tangled with salt. The man didn't speak, only walked slowly through the stalls, eyes fixed on something no one else could see. When the villagers followed him, he stepped into the morning fog and was gone. No footprints left in the sand. Days later, a dock worker at another port reported something eerily similar, a sailor standing at the end of the pier staring at the water. When hailed, he didn't answer. The dock worker swore the man's skin was pale, his lips moving soundlessly. He vanished when a wave rolled in. The stories multiplied. A child in Manila said she saw a man in a soaked uniform sitting on her bed at night, whispering in a language she didn't know. A woman in Singapore claimed she recognized her cousin, the junior engineer, Mateo Cruz, wandering a warehouse district holding a notebook, flipping its pages with trembling hands. Photographs surfaced, blurry and grainy, but enough to stir debate. Men in uniform, shapes their outlines indistinct. Faces caught mid-turn, always dissolving into the background like mist. Were these hallucinations of grief, collective imagination, or something else? One sighting carried more weight than the rest. In a bar near the harbor, a ship mechanic claimed a man sat next to him, ordered rum, and said nothing for 20 minutes. The bartender remembered his clothes torn, sea-stained, the smell of brine clinging to him. When the mechanic tried small talk, the man looked up and whispered, "It's behind you." The mechanic turned, saw nothing. When he faced forward again, the man was gone. His glass of rum, however, was still half full on the counter. That glass was later collected by investigators. Swabs revealed saltwater residue, but no fingerprints. Historians connected the sightings to the age-old motif of ghostly returns, sailors lost at sea, appearing briefly on land before vanishing again. In 1902, a British naval officer wrote of encountering his drowned brother on a pier in Gibraltar, dripping seawater, eyes glazed. He vanished into mist before the officer could approach. Folklore calls them drifted ones, echoes of those the sea hasn't fully claimed. But some sightings were more than fleeting. One family received a phone call in the dead of night. The caller ID matched the missing radio officer's number. When they answered, only static filled the line. Then faintly overlapping voices murmured, "Come down to the water." The call ended with a sharp crack, like a snapped wire. The phone company later confirmed the number had been disconnected months before. As these stories spread, Paranoia seeped into port towns. Dock workers refused night shifts. Fishermen claimed to see pale faces bobbing in the waves, staring up at them before slipping under. Even coastal police reported strange encounters, patrol lights sweeping across the water, catching glimpses of figures standing on the decks of ships that weren't really there. And always the same whispering phrase surfaced in testimonies, "It's behind us." Investigators who chased these sightings faced ridicule, but they couldn't ignore the consistency. The appearances weren't random, they formed a pattern stretching along the same trade route the vanished vessel had traveled. Some began to believe the missing crew hadn't died at all. They were following the route, still stepping briefly onto land before fading back into whatever space they now occupied. Others argued the sightings were bait lures meant to draw the living closer to the water. Inspector Hahn's disappearance fueled these fears. His colleagues swore his face was spotted once months later standing silently in a shipyard. He didn't speak, didn't move, and when approached, he melted into the shadows between cranes. Was he now part of them? Another sailor claimed by the same fate. Academic debate grew heated. Paranormal researchers argued that the crew had become liminal entities caught between sea and land, life and death. Skeptics countered that trauma was fueling hallucinations, a collective haunting born of fear. But the sightings kept coming, always damp, always silent, always looking just past the witness as though watching something over their shoulder. By the time officials tried to suppress the reports, the public had already given the case a name: the ship with no crew, and the sailors who walked back. And in harbors across the Pacific, whispers spread that the crew was still out there following the tide, waiting for someone else to look behind them. The sightings had reached fever pitch, and officials were desperate to quiet the growing storm of rumors. That's why most people never learned about the sea log. It surfaced in Manila, tucked inside the false bottom of a chest, auctioned off from a shipbreaker's yard. A collector of maritime artifacts found it, and recognizing the seal on the cover, turned it over to researchers. The seal was unmistakable, the same shipping company that owned the ship with no crew. The logbook was brittle pages browned with age. Dates placed it in the late 1800s. Yet what was written inside could not be dismissed as coincidence. The first entries were standard records of cargo weather and ports of call. But after 2 weeks at sea, the handwriting grew erratic. The captain described a container with no manifest loaded at the last port, a black iron box sealed with wax. The crew whispered that it should not have been taken aboard, but the shipping agents insisted. Days later, strange events began, sailors speaking in unison during their sleep, the ship's compass spinning wildly, phantom lights trailing them at night. The log recorded a chilling phrase, scrawled across multiple pages: "It's behind us." The same phrase from the engineer's notebook, the same phrase whispered in sightings more than a century later. One entry stood out: "The men have begun to vanish. First at night, then even in daylight. They walk into the fog and never return. I hear them at the door to my cabin, their voices layered atop one another, asking me to open. I dare not. The box hums at night as though it breathes. We are not the first to carry it. We will not be the last." The final line of the journal, written in a trembling hand, read, "If this book is found, know this: the sea does not keep what it takes, it delivers." The discovery ignited panic among the few investigators who saw it. It suggested a cycle spanning centuries. Different ships, different crews, the same unmarked container, the same disappearances. Was the vanished crew merely the latest link in a chain that stretched back generations? To make matters worse, forensic examination confirmed that the paper and ink were authentic to the 19th century. No forgery, no hoax. The shipping company issued an immediate gag order seizing the logbook for archival preservation. Officially, it was never mentioned again, but word leaked through whispers in the investigator circles, and then came the photographs. A historian cross-referenced the crew manifest from the 1800s with the faces of the missing modern sailors. He claimed with mounting dread that several looked eerily alike. Not identical, but close enough to be mistaken for descendants. Bloodlines, repeating across centuries. Inspector Hahn's private theory, once dismissed as obsession, now seemed horrifyingly plausible. Certain families bound to a contract with the sea drawn back again and again into the same fate. But what was the container? Theories bloomed. Some said it was a reliquary carrying remains not meant to rest on land. Others believed it was an artifact older than any ship, an object that demanded passage across waters in endless cycles. A darker theory suggested it wasn't cargo at all, but a vessel carrying something alive, something that required human crews as offerings. The journal offered one last clue. A crude sketch on its final page showed a symbol, a spiral with jagged spokes nearly identical to the carvings found in the cook's cabin on the ship with no crew. The spiral wasn't just decoration. It was a mark passed across time, stamped on every ship that carried the container. And investigators realized with a sinking certainty that this cycle hadn't ended. The sightings of the crew weren't hauntings. They were the beginnings of a delivery. Whatever the container carried, it was still en route. When the container resurfaced, it wasn't at sea. That was the first shock. It appeared at a shipping yard in Rotterdam, sitting quietly at the edge of Dock 17, under the shadow of cranes and container stacks, as if it had been there all along. No entry logs, no record of transport, no workers recalled moving it. Yet there it was, sealed with the same wax insignia seen in the centuries-old logbook. Workers described a low hum emanating from it. Others swore they heard tapping from inside like knuckles against metal. Officials were called immediately, but by the time inspectors arrived, the yard workers had fled. All except one. He was found sitting cross-legged in front of the container, eyes wide, whispering over and over, "It's not empty, it's not empty." The container was transferred to a secure facility under heavy guard. Cameras recorded everything. Armed men in hazard suits approached, cut the locks, and cracked open the steel doors. Inside was nothing but air, or so it seemed. Every camera, every monitor glitched for 5 seconds at the moment of opening. Static shredded the feed, and when the image returned, the men were still standing there, but their faces were pale, their suits slick with condensation, as though they had been standing in a rainstorm. They insisted the container was empty, nothing inside. But one guard quietly resigned the next day, claiming he had seen rows of eyes staring from the dark. Days later, reports flooded in from across Europe. A sailor swore he saw the vanished crew boarding a ferry in Calais. A fisherman in Iceland claimed a group of drenched men walked across the docks and vanished into fog. Security footage at Dover caught a blurred figure in a captain's coat, stepping from the mist and glancing directly at the camera. Each sighting occurred within 100 kilometers of Rotterdam, spreading outward like ripples from a stone dropped in water. Then came the captain. On a gray morning, he appeared at the port gates in Hamburg. Witnesses said he walked calmly, hands tucked behind his back, uniform torn but immaculate face unmistakable. His likeness matched the missing captain from the ship with no crew. He didn't speak, didn't resist when guards surrounded him. He simply allowed himself to be led away. But in interrogation, he claimed something impossible. "I am Captain Elias Varga," he said, voice steady. "I delivered the cargo as I was ordered." The investigators exchanged glances. Varga had vanished less than a year ago when the ship arrived empty in Singapore, and yet the man before them was older, his hair streaked with white, his face lined as though decades had passed. Forensic tests raised more questions than answers. DNA matched Captain Varga, fingerprints too, but the body showed signs of prolonged malnutrition, as if he had been adrift for decades. His blood contained elevated levels of salt far beyond normal human tolerance. And when questioned about his missing crew, he offered only this: "They are still aboard. You will see them again, when the tide allows." Investigators pressed him about the container. "It must keep moving," Varga whispered. "That is the bargain. As long as it travels, the sea stays quiet. Stop it, and the ocean comes for all of us." When asked who made the bargain, he smiled faintly and leaned closer as though sharing a secret meant for one ear only. You already know. It's why your harbors stay open, why your ships still float. The room fell silent. The next morning, Captain Varga was gone. Surveillance showed his cell door never opened. Guards reported nothing unusual, but the camera footage told a different story at 03:17 a.m. The lights flickered and a dense fog rolled through the corridor. For 13 seconds, visibility dropped to zero. When the fog lifted, the cell was empty. Only one thing remained on the bunk, a spiral scratched into the metal frame. News of his escape never reached the public. Authorities buried it under classified maritime security, but rumors bled out. Dock workers, sailors, and even fishermen in remote villages whispered of the spiral mark, carving it into wood and stone as a ward or a warning. And the container, it vanished from the secure facility the same night the captain disappeared. No alarms, no broken locks. It was simply gone. Some say it was seen days later loaded aboard another vessel bound for South America. Others swear it was shipped east toward the Pacific. The truth no one knows. But the hum returned to the docks, faint but unmistakable, like the heartbeat of something still traveling, still searching. And somewhere in the world, a new crew would soon hear the call. When Captain Varga vanished from his cell, investigators braced themselves for chaos. But the true unraveling began days later when he appeared again, this time in London. A CCTV camera caught him walking along the Thames, gloved hands, folded neatly behind his back as if on a casual promenade. His uniform was clean, dry, and pressed, his face younger than the man who had disappeared from the German facility. Investigators rushed to verify the footage only to discover something that froze them in place. At that same hour across the channel in Antwerp, another Captain Varga was spotted disembarking a cargo ship. Witnesses swore he nodded politely at customs officers before stepping into the fog. Two men, the same face, the same uniform, two places at once. Forensics tried to explain it away, lookalikes, imposters, digital manipulation. But within weeks, sightings multiplied. Paris, Oslo, even inland cities far from the coast. Men and women swore they encountered a man who matched the missing captain. His presence always the same, calm, deliberate eyes fixed forward as though following invisible coordinates. When confronted, he never resisted. Sometimes he spoke, repeating the same phrase over and over, "The voyage never ends." One investigator, a cryptographer named Dr. Louise Harlan, began compiling reports. She noticed a pattern. Each Varga appeared near bodies of water connected by shipping routes that traced almost perfectly the spiraling symbol scratched in his cell. The spiral wasn't just a mark. It was a map, a repeating loop spanning continents overlaid on shipping lanes centuries old. Debate exploded within academic and naval circles. Was it possible the captain existed in multiple timelines, simultaneously converging and diverging like ships passing in fog? Investigators and detectives are still debating whether we're seeing clones, phantoms, or some dimensional fracture, Harlan admitted during a closed-door conference. But the evidence suggests each Varga is not an imposter. They all believe they are the original, and perhaps in a sense they were. The most chilling moment came when authorities finally apprehended one of the captains near Marseille. He allowed himself to be handcuffed, sat calmly through questioning, and even offered a detailed account of the ship with no crew. But halfway through his statement, the lights flickered. For 3 seconds, the room plunged into darkness. When illumination returned, there were two men sitting in the interrogation chair, identical, both claiming to be Elias Varga, both equally confused. One began to laugh soft at first, then echoing unnaturally, as if others were laughing through him. The other stared at the investigators with hollow resignation. Within minutes, both men dissolved into salt water, drenching the floor, leaving only the spiral scratched into the steel chair. From that moment on, containment was abandoned. The realization spread quietly through intelligence agencies they weren't dealing with a man but with a phenomenon. The captain was not a singular being anymore. He was plural, an echo folded through time, tethered to the voyage, appearing wherever the container passed. The effect spread to the crew. Witnesses reported groups of sailors appearing in harbors, all wearing mismatched uniforms, faces exhausted but familiar. In one fishing town in Spain, a group of 6 men staggered onto the pier, dripping wet, speaking languages no one recognized. By the time authorities arrived, the men were gone, leaving behind puddles that evaporated too slowly for the heat of the sun. Meanwhile, in a locked vault beneath Brussels, investigators discovered something even stranger: multiple death certificates for Captain Elias Varga. One dated 1892, lost at sea. Another 1947, declared drowned. Another 1983, heart attack aboard a cargo freighter. And the most recent, of course, the report filed in Singapore just a year ago. The same man, the same name, the same face, over and over again. A cycle documented across centuries, repeating identities as though time itself were recycling him. And then came the question no one dared voice out loud. If Captain Varga could multiply across time, what about his crew? How many versions of them were already out there, walking docks, slipping into towns, vanishing into fog? And what happened when those versions overlapped? The investigators had no answer, only dread. Because if identity could splinter and persist across generations, maybe the voyage wasn't just endless, it was contagious. The recordings arrived without warning. A small research vessel in the North Sea picked them up first, a ghost signal bleeding into maritime radio frequencies. The crew thought it was interference at first, but the voice was unmistakable. Captain Elias Varga, calm and clear, repeating coordinates in the open ocean. But there was something wrong with the audio. His words were layered like dozens of versions of the same man, speaking in imperfect unison. Each syllable dragged, bending into a chorus. Then, beneath the coordinates, another sound emerged, dozens of other voices. The crew, men, women, even children, speaking in different languages, overlapping, chanting the same fragmented phrase, "We are still aboard." Forensics experts triangulated the signal, but the impossible truth, it wasn't coming from one location. The same transmission was detected simultaneously in the Arctic, the Indian Ocean, and the Pacific. The voices were everywhere, an echo from the waves themselves. The phenomenon rattled naval intelligence. Investigators argued endlessly. Some insisted it was evidence of temporal bleed-through, multiple versions of the crew trapped across different eras, overlapping through radio frequencies. Others said it was something more primitive, more ancient, the ocean itself carrying memory, transmitting voices like a conch shell pressed to your ear. But one fact terrified them all: the coordinates repeated in the message matched the spiral pattern found in Varga's cell. A map traced not across land, but across currents. In an underground bunker, specialists replayed the transmission frame by frame, slowing it to the edge of distortion. That's when they heard something new. A faint knock, 3 beats, then silence, then 3 beats again. A code, perhaps, or something knocking from inside the signal itself. A historian cross-referencing the data realized with horror that the same 3-beat pattern had been reported centuries ago. In the 1800s, British sailors wrote of the knocking beneath the keel, a sound that preceded crew vanishings. In the 1940s, German U-boats described phantom tapping in their hulls during patrols. Even Polynesian oral traditions referenced the rhythm of the sea's prisoner, a beat echoing under the waves. It wasn't just the crew reaching out, it was whatever was with them. The transmissions grew stronger over weeks, now captured by amateur radio hobbyists across the globe. Recordings uploaded online were quickly scrubbed, but not before millions heard the haunting chorus. One clip, only 20 seconds long, spread like wildfire. Aboard. We are still aboard. Aboard. We are still, followed by a single blood-freezing line spoken in perfect English. The voyage is not yours to end. Meanwhile, coastlines reported strange phenomena. Fishermen off Portugal found their nets heavy with salt-crusted uniforms matching 19th century styles. In Japan, a lighthouse keeper swore he saw dozens of men in soaked naval coats walking single file across the beach, leaving no footprints behind. And in Miami, a cruise ship passenger captured cell phone footage of a man in a captain's coat standing at the water's edge. He looked directly at the camera, lifted a hand in salute, and vanished as a wave broke over him. Everywhere the same figure, everywhere the same echo. The final transmission hit harder than all the rest. It wasn't coordinates. It wasn't the crew's chorus. It was silence. Then a single voice, low and deliberate, cutting through static. The sea does not keep. The sea delivers. The same words scrawled in the 19th century logbook. The same warning investigators had tried to suppress. And then, as the signal ended, came the faint hum, the heartbeat sound reported from the container. Louder this time, stronger, pulsing across frequencies as if the ocean itself was breathing. For one chilling moment, every receiver worldwide registered the same spike. Ships, planes, radios, satellites, every channel went quiet except for the hum. Then it was gone. But the spiral remained, carved into walls, drawn on docks, etched into sand by tides, appearing everywhere as though the sea was leaving a signature. The investigators realized too late the transmissions weren't warnings. They were invitations. The transmissions ceased as suddenly as they had begun. For weeks, silence blanketed the airwaves. Governments exhaled, grateful for quiet, but the investigators knew better. Silence in this story had never meant safety. It meant waiting. And then the ship returned. It was first sighted off the coast of Chile, a black silhouette against the horizon. Radar confirmed its shape, a cargo vessel, same dimensions, same registry as the ship with no crew. Yet this was impossible. That ship had been impounded, dismantled, and broken apart months earlier. Still there, it was gliding across the water without awake lights glowing faintly, though no generators ran. Fishing boats dared to approach, but every time they drew near, fog rolled in thick and sudden. When it cleared, the vessel had drifted miles away, as if distance itself bent around it. Weeks later, it appeared again, this time in the South China Sea, then the Gulf of Aden, then impossibly in the Great Lakes of North America, though no canal locks had opened to admit it. Every sighting came with the same report, the crew visible on deck, faces, pale movements, mechanical eyes unfocused. They waved not in distress but in ritual, a signal of passage. And always near the stern stood Captain Elias Varga. Theories spiraled. Some claimed the ship itself had become the container, a vessel not of steel but of memory. Others believed it was no longer bound by water but by a cycle older than nations, older than charts, older even than the ocean as we know it. But among investigators, one belief hardened into certainty: the ship was not simply traveling, it was delivering. Satellite images confirmed the spiral route traced across seas and harbors, a massive geometric pattern etched into the surface of the world. Ports touched, then abandoned. Shores grazed, then left behind. Each pass marked by inexplicable disappearances, a handful of dock workers gone, entire fishing crews vanished, even a group of tourists who never disembarked their ferry. Always small numbers, never enough to raise alarms, but taken together, thousands missing. A new crew gathered, slowly replenished, quietly absorbed into the voyage. The cycle had restarted. The strangest account came from a Brazilian salvage diver, one of the few living witnesses who dared swim close to the ship. He described seeing the hull up close, not rust, not steel, but faces, pressed into the metal mouths, open eyes closed, as though hundreds of bodies had been fused into the vessel itself. He swore one of those faces blinked at him. He never dived again. As reports spread, something strange happened on land. The spiral appeared not only in harbors and beaches, but inland, carved into trees, burned into asphalt, etched onto glass windows overnight. People began dreaming of the ship of water lapping against their beds of Captain Varga, knocking softly at their doors. Academics argued bitterly. Investigators bickered. Yet one phrase ended every debate. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether the ship is a haunting, a curse, or a living organism. But they all agreed on one thing: it would not stop. One final report, classified but leaked years later, described an intercepted radio signal believed to be the last transmission. It carried no words this time, only the hum, steady and strong like a heartbeat filling the world. And then a whisper, layered infinite in countless languages, but one meaning: we are the voyage now. The ship has since been spotted less frequently, but sightings persist. Always sudden, always fleeting, always leaving something behind: a uniform, a footprint, a spiral. And though authorities deny it, dock workers and sailors know the truth. The sea doesn't just swallow, it gives back. The ship is still out there, sailing, recruiting, delivering. And maybe one day, when the fog rolls too close to your harbor, when you hear the knock against your door at night, you'll understand what they mean when they whisper, "The voyage never ends." So here we are at the edge of another mystery that has no neat ending. The ship slips away into the mist, and with it the questions we will probably never answer. Was Captain Varga a man cursed to repeat his voyage, or a vessel himself carrying something much older than we can imagine? Were his many identities fractured echoes of one soul, or did the sea create copies like ripples spreading across water? Think about it: centuries of vanishings, repeating bloodlines, identical names across different eras. A container that appears where it shouldn't, a logbook that warns us the sea does not keep what it takes but delivers it back. Maybe we've misunderstood all along. Maybe the ocean isn't empty, it's full of memories, voices, and passengers who never chose their tickets. And the spiral, it's not just a symbol, it's a reminder that the voyage isn't linear. It folds, curves, loops. What was lost returns. What vanishes reappears. Maybe that's why people still glimpse the ship in harbors, why fishermen swear they see pale figures waving from the decks, why entire families wake at night to the sound of distant knocking. If you ever find yourself near the coast and the fog grows too thick, listen carefully. If you hear the hum, if you see a figure in a captain's coat raising his hand, don't wave back. Some invitations are safer left unanswered, because some voyages aren't meant to end, they're meant to continue forever.